Okay, so have you noticed uh, how everyone's using podcasts now to learn English?
Yeah, it's really interesting. The research shows that even like passively listening, like when you're commuting, can actually really boost your vocabulary.
Oh yeah, for sure. I've even heard that if you combine language learning with physical activity,
Yeah.
it helps you remember things better. So
Exactly.
maybe like listening to a podcast during a workout could be the way to go.
Absolutely. And today we're going to do a deep dive into why this is becoming so popular and you know how to make the most of it for yourself.
Okay, so I guess one of the big things about using podcasts to learn English is that it's kind of entertainment and education all in one.
That's a really good point.
It's almost like binge watching, but for your ears and without the guilt.
Yeah. So instead of, slogging through a textbook, you can choose podcasts on topics that you're actually interested in. So you kind of absorb the language without even realizing that you're studying.
Right. And that's got to be huge for motivation,
It
right?
should.
If you enjoy what you're listening to, you're way more likely to stick with it.
For sure.
Imagine listening to like a true crime podcast and suddenly you understand all the legal jargon.
Exactly. Or you could be, listening to a cooking show and pick up all sorts of culinary vocabulary.
Yeah, that's cool. So it's not just about learning individual words, but more like getting a feel for how the language is used in different situations.
Exactly. It's about immersing yourself in the real living language.
Okay, that makes sense. So another big plus for podcasts, I think,
Hmm.
is the multitasking part. You can just slip in some learning while you're doing other everyday things.
That's true.
I mean, our sources are full of examples about this.
Yeah, like folding laundry becomes a vocabulary building session. Your commute turns into like a pronunciation workshop.
Right. Even walking the dog could be a chance to practice listening.
For sure. But I bet some dogs are getting pretty confused, though.
Yeah, they must be like, why is my owner suddenly talking back to the podcast?
Right. But it really does work. I think the key is to be intentional about it.
Okay, yeah.
So don't just passively listen, but actively engage with the material.
Okay, so how do we do that?
Well, one technique is to use transcripts. A lot of podcasts actually provide them. It's really helpful. It's almost like having subtitles, but for your ears.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Especially for those tricky words that, sound similar but are spelled differently. It's like a cheat sheet, but for your ears.
Exactly. And if there's a phrase you don't quite catch, just rewind and listen again. Repetition is, really powerful for language learning.
Okay, so we're actively listening, we're using transcripts, we're rewinding, repeating. What else can we do to really maximize our learning?
Well, one of the most effective techniques is called shadowing. It's a favorite among, professional interpreters.
Mm.
It involves mimicking the speaker's pronunciation in real time.
Oh, wow. So it's like a vocal workout, but for your English.
Exactly. You're basically training your mouth and ears to work better together. Try to match their intonation, their rhythm, even their pauses.
I bet that takes some practice.
It does, but it's really rewarding. And here's a pro tip. Record yourself while you're shadowing.
Oh, that's a good idea.
It lets you hear your own pronunciation and see where you can improve.
Yeah, that makes sense. I can imagine some people might feel a little self-conscious at first, but it's probably worth it in the long run.
For sure. Remember, it's all about progress, not perfection. The more you practice, the better you'll get.
So, one thing that really stood out to me when I was reading all this was just the variety of podcasts out there. It seems like there's one for every kind of learner and every learning style.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it?
Like beginners could start with something like ESL Pod, where the hosts speak slowly and clearly and explain grammar.
Yeah.
Then, as you get better, you can move on to podcasts that are made for native speakers like All Ears English,
Yeah.
which also gives you insights into American culture.
Yeah. And for more advanced learners, there are news podcasts like The Daily or informational ones like Stuff You Should Know. The key is to find something you actually enjoy listening to.
Yeah, so it doesn't have to be specifically a language learning podcast. Just find something that aligns with your interests.
Exactly. If you're a foodie, there are tons of podcasts about cooking. If you're into history, there are podcasts about every era imaginable.
It's like sneaking in English practice while doing what you already love to do.
Absolutely. And one of the best parts is that this amazing resource is mostly free.
That's a huge plus,
Yeah.
especially compared to the cost of traditional language classes. All you need is a smartphone, internet, and a good pair of headphones.
Yeah. Maybe a little bit of courage to try out the new words and phrases you're learning.
Oh, for sure. It's one thing to understand a word, but it's another thing to actually use it in a conversation.
Absolutely. And that's where podcasts are so helpful because they expose you to real life English,
Yeah.
like the kind of language that people actually use every day.
Right. So instead of learning phrases like, excuse me, where's the library?
Hmm.
You're learning things like, what's up? Or let's grab coffee. It's like going beyond textbook English and really getting a sense of how the language works in real situations.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another great thing about podcasts, the flexibility. Unlike structured classes, you can learn whenever and wherever you want.
Yeah, I mean, you can listen during your commute, while cooking dinner, even relaxing in the bath.
Right. Well, maybe keep your phone away from the bathwater, just in case.
Good point. Okay, so we've covered that podcasts are fun, flexible, and affordable, but are they actually effective?
Hmm. That's where it gets really interesting. I think the beauty of this method is that it's almost like deceptively effective.
Oh, how so?
Because you're enjoying yourself, you kind of forget that you're studying.
That's true. And the repetition, hearing those words and phrases over and over in different contexts, really helps, even if you don't realize it.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to pick podcasts that you actually find interesting. The more you enjoy it, the more you'll absorb.
It's like sneaking in a language lesson while you're listening to your favorite show.
Exactly. And if you want to take it even further, you can actively engage with activities like shadowing or even note-taking.
So it's not just passive listening. It's about actually taking an active role in your learning.
For sure. And that brings us to the next part of our deep dives, where we'll explore some specific strategies and techniques for maximizing your learning with podcasts.
All right, so we've talked about how podcasts can be this like really fun and engaging way to learn English. But I'm kind of curious. We mentioned that podcasts are good for multitasking. Is there any research to back that up?
Actually, yeah, there is. Some studies have shown that if you combine language learning with like physical activity, it can actually help you remember things better. It's like your brain makes connections between the movement and the new words you're hearing.
That's fascinating. So you're saying that if I'm out for a run and I'm listening to a podcast about grammar, I might actually remember those rules better.
Yeah, possibly. It seems like our brains like to have multiple inputs when we're learning new things.
Well, that makes sense. So it's not just convenient, but there's a real cognitive benefit.
Exactly.
So speaking of cognitive benefits, what about vocabulary?
Okay. Yeah.
We all know that vocabulary is so important for learning any language, but, sometimes memorizing lists of words feels like a chore.
Oh, I hear you. But with podcasts, you can just naturally expand your vocabulary just by listening to engaging content.
It's like osmosis for your brain.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. As you listen to different podcasts, you'll come across new words and phrases, and you're hearing them in context, so it's easier to understand their meaning and how to use them right.
Right. So instead of just like memorizing a definition from a dictionary, you're actually hearing how that word is used in real conversation.
Exactly. And the more you hear it repeated in different contexts, the more likely you are to remember it.
So what if you come across a word that you've never heard before? Do you stop the podcast and look it up?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, first you could try to guess the meaning from the context.
Yes.
A lot of times you can get a pretty good idea even if you've never seen the word before.
We need to channel our inner Sherlock Holmes.
Exactly. Put those deduction skills to work. And then, of course, if you're still unsure after listening, you can always look it up. There are some great online dictionaries and apps that can help.
And speaking of apps, there are some that actually sync with podcasts, right?
Yeah, that's right. Some apps actually let you listen to a podcast while you're reading the transcript. And some even let you look up word definitions as you go. It's almost like having a personal tutor right in your pocket.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So you can really customize the whole learning experience to fit your needs.
Exactly. And that kind of brings us to another important point. Choosing the right podcasts for your level and interests.
Right. We've talked about the variety of podcasts out there, but how do you know which ones are right for you?
Well, if you're a beginner, you might want to start with podcasts that are specifically designed for language learners.
Right.
They often speak a bit slower and use simpler vocabulary, so it's easier to follow.
Okay, and then as you improve, you can move on to more challenging podcasts.
Exactly. And it's also important to choose podcasts that you find genuinely interesting.
Oh, yeah.
If you're bored, you're just not going to pay attention or remember anything.
You got to find that sweet spot between learning and entertainment.
Yeah, for sure. If you're really passionate about history, find a history podcast. If you love true crime, well, there's a whole world of podcasts dedicated to that genre.
And if you're into grammar, well, there's even podcasts for that.
Seriously, there are podcasts for almost every interest you can imagine. The key is to just experiment and see what you like.
And don't be afraid to try out different accents and dialects, too. You might be surprised at how much variation there is in English.
That's a great point. Listening to podcasts from different regions can really expose you to different ways of speaking, different vocab, and even cultural nuances.
It's not just about learning the language, it's also about learning about the world.
Exactly. And that brings us to what makes podcasts so valuable, their authenticity.
Oh, what do you mean by authenticity?
Well, I mean, the podcasts offer this really cool glimpse into real life conversations and situations.
Yep.
You're hearing people use English the way they actually speak it, not just, the way it's written in textbooks.
Right, so it's kind of like a front row seat to how the language is used in different contexts.
Exactly. You hear idioms, slang, humor, different regional dialects. It's so much richer than just reading a textbook.
I bet that really helps with listening comprehension and overall fluency.
Oh, absolutely. The more you're exposed to real-life English, the better you'll understand it and be able to speak it yourself.
Okay, so we've talked about choosing the right podcasts, engaging with the content authentically, but how do we make sure we're actually learning something from all this listening?
Yeah, good question. That's where those active listening techniques come in. Remember, it's not enough to just passively listen while you're doing other things. You need to be actively engaged with the material.
Okay, what are some examples of active listening techniques?
Well, one thing you can try is taking notes. Jot down new words, interesting phrases, or even just like key takeaways.
Oh, that's a good idea. It helps you stay focused, and then you have something to refer back to.
Exactly. You could also try to summarize the podcast after you finish listening.
Oh, okay, so like test your comprehension skills.
Right. And if you're feeling really ambitious, you could even try recording yourself. That'll force you to think more deeply about what you heard, and it gives you a chance to practice speaking.
So it's not just about listening, it's about using all those language skills. Listening, speaking, reading, writing.
Exactly. The more you can use those skills together, the faster you'll improve.
So we've got the active listening techniques, note-taking, summarizing. Is there anything else we can do to really get the most out of podcasts for learning English?
Well, one thing some people find helpful is to actually listen to the same podcast multiple times.
Wouldn't that get kind of boring?
Well, it depends on the podcast, of course. But listening to a podcast more than once can help you pick up on details you might have missed the first time.
It's like watching your favorite movie again. You always notice something new.
Exactly. And each time you listen, you're just reinforcing your understanding.
So you're solidifying what you've learned.
Precisely. And if there's a transcript available, you could even try reading along while you listen.
Oh, okay. So just finding different ways to engage with the material and make it stick.
Exactly. And speaking of making things stick, let's talk about shadowing.
Ah, yes, shadowing. We touched on this a bit earlier. I'm excited to hear more about how it works.
Yeah, so shadowing is this technique that's often used by interpreters and language learners who really want to improve their pronunciation and fluency. Basically, it involves mimicking the speaker's speech patterns.
Oh, wow. So it's like you're trying to become their vocal twin.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. You're paying attention to their intonation, their rhythm, their pauses.
I bet it takes some practice.
It does, but it can be incredibly effective. It's like a workout for your mouth and ears. You're training those muscles to produce the sounds of English correctly.
And I bet it helps with listening comprehension, too.
Absolutely. If you can pronounce something correctly, you're more likely to understand it when you hear someone else say it.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So how do you actually go about shadowing?
Okay, so you start by choosing a short segment of a podcast, maybe a minute or two. Then listen to that segment a few times, really paying attention to how the speaker pronounces the words.
Okay.
And then once you're comfortable with it, you start mimicking. You try to repeat their words as closely as possible, matching their intonation and rhythm.
I'm guessing it's helpful to record yourself during this?
Oh, it definitely can be. It lets you hear your pronunciation and see where you need to improve.
Yeah, and it's a good way to track your progress over time.
Exactly. And don't worry if you make mistakes at first. Everybody does. The key is to just keep practicing and have fun with it.
Okay, so we've got the active listening techniques, note-taking, summarizing, shadowing.
Yeah.
It seems like there's a lot you can do to really maximize those podcasts.
There is. And remember, you don't have to do everything at once. Choose what resonates with you and just incorporate it into your routine.
And don't be afraid to experiment, right?
Exactly. You might discover something new that works really well for you.
Speaking of experimenting, let's talk about choosing the right resources.
Okay.
We've talked about the fact that there are podcasts out there for every interest and level, but it can feel pretty overwhelming to know where to start.
Yeah, that's true. But don't worry, we can help you navigate the world of podcasts.
Okay, so where do we even begin?
Well, one of the first things to consider is your level of English. if you're a beginner, you might want to start with those podcasts that are, made for language learners.
Right.
They're going to speak at a slower pace and use simpler vocabulary, maybe explain some grammar concepts.
Makes sense. And then as you progress, you can move on to more challenging things.
Exactly. And it's really important to choose things that you find interesting.
That is for sure.
If you're bored, you're just not going to pay attention.
You got to find that sweet spot, right?
Yeah.
Where learning is fun.
Yeah, exactly. So, if you're passionate about history, find a history podcast. Love true crime. Well, there are tons of podcasts about that.
And if you're really into grammar, well, there are podcasts for that too.
I'm telling you, there are podcasts for almost any interest you can imagine. The key is to experiment, see what you enjoy.
And don't be afraid to try out different accents and dialects. You might be surprised at how much variation there is, within English.
That's a really good point. Listening to podcasts from different regions can really open up your ears to those different pronunciation styles, different vocab, even cultural things.
Yeah, so it's not just learning English, it's kind of learning about the world through the lens of English.
Exactly. And one of the coolest things about podcasts is that they're constantly being updated. There's always something new to discover.
That's true. So how can our listeners stay up to date on the, latest and greatest podcasts for learning English?
Well, there are a few ways. One is to just follow language learning blogs and websites. A lot of them have sections dedicated to, podcasts.
That's a good idea. And what about social media?
Oh, yeah. A lot of podcasters and language communities are active on social media, so you can follow them to get all the latest news.
And I guess you could also get recommendations from, friends and other language learners.
That's right. Sometimes those recommendations are the best because, you trust those people.
So there are definitely a lot of ways to stay in the loop.
Definitely.
And as we continue our deep dive, we'll explore some specific podcast recommendations.
Yeah, we'll cover a range of genres and levels.
Perfect. Something for everyone. But before we get to that, I want to talk about the importance of consistency.
Okay, consistency, yeah.
What do you mean by consistency?
Well, I mean that it's important to make podcast listening a regular habit. Just like any skill, language learning needs practice.
Right. So it's not enough to just listen every now and then.
Yeah, exactly. It's way more effective if you listen regularly, even if it's just for a few minutes each day.
So consistency is key.
Exactly. And the great thing about podcasts is that they make it easy to be consistent. You can listen while you're commuting, working out, doing chores.
Right. It's like you're sneaking in a little bit of learning throughout your day.
Absolutely. And those little bits add up to make a big difference in your fluency and confidence.
It's like brushing your teeth, but for your English.
Oh, I love that. Just like you brush your teeth every day, you can listen to podcasts every day to maintain good, I guess we could say, language hygiene.
That's a great way to put it. And speaking of thinking about things in new ways, let's move on to some specific podcast recommendations for our listeners. All right, so it's time for what we've all been waiting for, the podcast recommendations. I know our listeners are super excited to get some titles to, add to their playlists.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm excited to share some of my favorites. But before we jump in, I think it's important to remember that the best podcast for you is really going to depend on your own personal goals and what you're interested in.
Right, totally. We've been talking a lot about personalization, so it makes sense that our recommendations should, reflect that.
Absolutely. So let's start with those who are just starting out.
All right.
For beginners, I always recommend Learn English Podcast by the British Council.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that's a good one. What makes it so great for beginners?
Well, the hosts speak very clearly, and it's a little bit slower than you might find in podcasts for native speakers. And they cover tons of everyday topics, like ordering food, asking for directions.
So it's perfect for building those conversational skills.
Exactly. Another good option for beginners is Voice of America, Learning English. It's got news and current events, but it's specially made for English learners.
Oh, perfect for anyone who wants to, stay up to date with what's going on.
Exactly. And the cool thing about both of these podcasts is that they have transcripts and extra learning materials on their websites.
Oh, wow. So you can really go deep and practice other skills like, reading and writing too.
Exactly. Now, for those who are at an intermediate level, I highly recommend All Ears English.
Okay.
It's hosted by two American English teachers who offer lots of tips on American culture and conversation styles.
I've heard that one mentioned a lot. Seems like it's super popular.
It is, and for good reason. The hosts are really engaging and, they make it fun. They cover a wide range of topics that are, just right for intermediate learners.
Awesome. And what about for advanced learners? Are there any you would recommend?
Of course. For anyone who's looking for a real challenge, I always say The Daily by the New York Times. It's in-depth reporting on current events, a great way to stay informed and expose yourself to more, complex language.
Definitely not for the faint of heart.
That's true. But if you want to push yourself and really improve your listening comprehension, it's a great option.
Okay, so we've got some fantastic recommendations for beginners, intermediate, and advanced learners. But what about people looking for something, you know, more specific?
Ah, that's where it gets fun. The great thing about podcasts is that there's truly something for everyone, no matter how niche your interests are.
Right. Like if you're obsessed with true crime, there's a podcast for that. History
Exactly.
buff, podcast for that. Sci-fi fan. You guessed it, there's a podcast for that too.
Seriously. And the beauty of listening to podcasts on topics that you already love is that, it makes learning English feel more like a hobby than, a chore.
That's like the best of both worlds, right?
Absolutely. You're learning and you're enjoying yourself at the same time.
So don't be afraid to, explore and see what's out there.
There's a whole world of podcasts just waiting to be discovered.
And remember, everything we shared today are just suggestions. There are so many other amazing podcasts out there, and the best way to find them is to just start listening
Exactly.
and see what clicks with you.
As you continue on your English learning journey, just remember to stay curious, be persistent, and most importantly, have fun.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So to our listeners out there, we encourage you to grab those headphones, hit play, and let the podcast learning begin.
Happy listening, everyone!